This is Talk Radio.
Keeping you up to date across the UK. Online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
Rob Rinder on Talk Radio.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Rob Rinder on Drive, and it's 5:34, and it's time for the weekend. But before we go, it's our opportunity to listen to people, well, not shouting at each other, but disagreeing with each other on our political panel. Today, we've got Joseph Silke, Communications Manager at Bright Blue, a Conservative think tank, and the very brave Benjamin Butterworth, who's the late editor at the I newspaper. I say he's brave because he says what he thinks, and he's prepared to come on here and say it. Many people are not. Now, Joseph Silke, Benjamin Butterworth, as we approach the reflection of tomorrow, 9/11, we also have to ask the difficult political questions about what happened afterwards. Do you think, I'm going to start here, and it's not necessarily a philosophical question, it's about the facts of what ensued after that horrendous incident. I'll start with you, Benjamin Butterworth. Do you think that the hawkish response to 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan and then the subsequent invasion of Iraq, was justified?
I think, the justification for it at the time was that we had just been, or America, the West, had just been attacked by Al-Qaeda that was rampant in Afghanistan, and it was about trying to stop them expanding and having their base from Afghanistan to continue attacking the West. And I think that was perfectly justified at the time. And I think the overwhelming majority of British people thought it was justified as well. That changed into a nation-building mission. And I think it's clear from what's happened, the tragedy in the last month in particular, that the nation building completely failed. But I don't think it would be right to think that it was wrong to go into Afghanistan because of what's happened recently, because, we have to look at the facts, and there haven't been the spread of terrorist attacks. And I think in 2001, many people feared that attacks like 9/11 would become normal life. And thank God that there haven't been anything like as many as people feared.
Joseph Silke, it did start with a very clear and precise mission. Let's get into Afghanistan. Let's get rid of the Taliban, who are giving succor and sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, who did this. It then very rapidly altered and morphed into a nation-building project. What do you think, thinking about it and reflecting it on the anniversary tomorrow?
Well, I think the rage and the fear was an understandable reaction. 9/11 was such a traumatic event. George Bush and those around him, particularly people like Dick Cheney, are still viewed now as sort of satanic figures. But that BBC documentary recently really humanized them in a way which I thought was very powerful. And I agree that the invasion of Afghanistan was seemingly unavoidable. I think to some extent, George Bush was sort of a prisoner of events in that regard. But then there was that transition, as you say, into a global war on terror, which became almost like a quasi-global crusade in which Bush was like on a mission from God, and he had his own narrative about good versus evil. And I think potentially that's where it starts to unravel.
Mm-hmm. Now, thinking and reflecting on that, I'd assume you'd agree with that, wouldn't you, Benjamin Butterworth? That I think even the First Lady, Laura Bush, wasn't very pleased with the language that was used, a kind of cowboyish approach to getting out and killing the terrorist, or however it was pronounced by George W. Bush.
I mean, I think in the sense of trying to get Al-Qaeda under control and to try and stop these cells growing, that in that sense, going into Afghanistan works. Now, I have to be honest, and maybe this isn't the view you'd expect, but I actually think, though it's clearly not worked so well, nation building and trying to stop the Taliban controlling Afghanistan was the right thing to do. My view is that the responsible thing to do when you see authoritarian, exploitative, people with dark ages ideologies trying to destroy their own people. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you don't look the other way. I don't think that's the Christian thing to do. And I think when countries like Britain and America intervene, they are doing the right thing, because those people that live there are struggling to stand up for themselves under the severe repression that groups like the Taliban execute. And I think actually it was right to stay in Afghanistan for all those years. And I generally think that liberal intervention, you might call it, is the responsible thing to do. And I'd argue it was in some ways the left-wing thing to do, because there's nothing left-wing or progressive about leaving women and minorities and people with different religious views to be persecuted in their own country.
Well, I said you say it like you think it. Joseph Silke, liberal democracy at the end of a gun starts in Afghanistan. We asked the question why it starts there, and no doubt Benjamin Butterworth will be thinking about it. Why not the Congo and China and more or less every Arab state which has not just bad women's rights, to say the very least, and to be euphemistic about it, but almost non-existent LGBT rights. Should we be nation building in those places where we don't like their government, we don't like their attitude to minorities, etc.?
I think we were certainly wrong to pull out of Afghanistan after 20 years of investment and resources and progress in that country. But I think we do have to be slightly wary of, in general, I'm in favor of liberal interventionism where it can work, but there are limits to it, and that America and the West doesn't have unlimited resources. And we shouldn't necessarily go into every single battle. We have to pick our battles and do it where we can do it most effectively.
Benjamin Butterworth, I've got to ask you this question before we move on to the next topic. If that's your sort of fundamental philosophy, you look around the world from North Korea to, as I say, to Qatar, to Saudi Arabia, going to emphasize and echo that country, Saudi Arabia, and the things that they do. Why aren't we invading there in nation building?
I mean, I think the obvious point to acknowledge is that if we attempted to have military in Saudi Arabia, we would clearly lose. However, what we could do, and I think we're profound hypocrites, is that we sell arms to Saudi Arabia, which, that funds so much of the imbalance and the dangers that goes on across the Middle East. And so we shouldn't be selling arms to countries like that. When it comes to Qatar and the World Cup, next year, we should have at the least a diplomatic boycott where we don't send any of our royals or our politicians there to stand up for it. But I don't think, though you could call me a hypocrite or inconsistent, I don't think the fact that we would be not able to take the military action in Saudi Arabia that we can in Afghanistan is a reason to not do it in countries like Afghanistan. And the truth is that countries like Russia and China and Saudi Arabia are the ones that are fueling so much of many of these problems. And they're the countries that we should be trying to confront as much as we can with economic sanctions and with diplomatic sanctions that we do not do.
Benjamin Butterworth, I mean, you're swimming as ever against the tide and all this saber rattling, people will say. If you look at the impact on war, it always affects the poorest, both in the countries that we're seeking to project this liberal democracy on, but especially the poorest in our own countries, as we do nothing but, amongst other things, invest money in the big industrial military complex. But sadly, we have to move on to the next topic, where I have to say this story gets more and more confusing. It seems at the moment that Priti Patel is withholding money from the French unless the French do her bidding and turn the boats back. Is she right to demand that the French do exactly what some would argue law requires them to do, and to ensure that people do not get on boats in the first place? Benjamin Butterworth?
I mean, yeah, in a sense, yes, of course, that France should do everything that it can to make sure that people aren't getting these boats and going into the Channel, which is the busiest shipping lane in the world. It's treacherous, it's dangerous, and there's nothing compassionate about letting people get in those boats, some of them extremely unstable, when they're risking their lives. It's the same reason why the RNLI should always rescue the people in there, and no questions should be asked. It's simply about saving those lives. My difficulty with what Priti Patel has done is that I think this is little more than politicking. She knows that it is incredibly unpopular for various reasons, that so many people are coming across the Channel and risking their lives, and she is desperately trying to get headlines to look like she's doing something when clearly nothing is being fixed when you have 1,000 people a day risking their lives in those waters. And I'd also just suggest, you said we were moving on from Afghanistan question. I'm afraid these two are directly linked, because when you have such instability in other parts of the world, that's where you get the situation on our own shores, and why we should try and help to fix those problems around the world, because it does end up directly at Dover.
Joseph Silke, it's our problem, our fault?
Well, the French have violated their agreement. There should be proper ways to resolve that. But I mean, the idea of towing migrants back to France seems a bit kind of farcical. I agree that it's really seems like a bluff. I mean, angering the French might be fun, but it won't necessarily solve the problem. Nor do I suspect that the Coast Guard will actually go through with it. It seems very dangerous. If it's legal, as the government are suggesting, and they should publish the legal advice that they've received. And I mean, the tricky part is, say if people coming across the channel drown on the Home Secretary's orders because of a strategy like this, then that could be potentially disastrous. Imagine an Afghan who's been abandoned in Kabul, tries to make it across the channel, then drowns because the Coast Guard tried to tow them back to France.
Well, you seem to agree with that, so I have to put the other side here. It does not necessarily my point of view. We had a barrister on before. I'm here as an advocate, making sure that my listeners' points of view are also heard here. And, the reality is, one would ask you, what are they doing getting on a boat from France when they've already reached a safe country in the first place?
I'm sympathetic to that point of view.
It's the right legal point. It's the right legal point of view. You quote law at me. I've got to quote law back. The first thing many migrants and refugees do is break the law in two ways. Firstly, by coming illegally, and secondly, by not claiming asylum in their first port of safety. And a lot of people feel it's fine. Come here, make the application by all means. And if we can provide refuge, fine. We are a generous country that are open to that, to say the very least. We've done it for generations. But we're not happy to extend that welcome to lawbreakers.
Some of the conditions in refugee centres in France seem pretty dire, to be fair to them. But I agree with government that we need to stop these unsustainable, spontaneous, dangerous channel crossings. But I think the best way to do that is actually to expand controlled, safe and legal routes for people to come here through proper channels. And we can do that by expanding the global resettlement scheme.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got Joseph Silke, their communications manager at Bright Blue, which is a conservative think tank, and always interesting. I definitely think you should read his Twitter or read him in the newspaper. It's Benjamin Butterworth, the late editor at that newspaper.